Jazz critic called Miles Davis history's most brilliant sellout. Miles's response destroyed him. When Stanley Crouch, one of the most powerful and respected voices in jazz criticism, launched this devastating attack in 1986, he thought he was delivering a killing blow to Miles's reputation. But what Miles said back didn't just defend his own artistic choices. It redefined the entire relationship between critics and artists, and became one of the most quoted responses in music history. Stanley Crouch was not just any jazz critic. By the 1980s, he had established himself as one of the most influential voices in American music journalism, a man whose opinions could make or break careers, whose approval was sought by musicians across the spectrum, and whose condemnation was feared throughout the jazz world. Crouch was a formidable intellectual presence, a writer, cultural critic, and philosopher who brought serious academic weight to his musical judgments. He wrote for The Village Voice, Downbeat, and later for major publications like the New York Daily News. When Stanley Crouch spoke about jazz, people listened. When he praised an artist, record sales followed. When he criticized someone, venues started having second thoughts about bookings. But Crouch was also a traditionalist, a man who believed deeply in what he saw as the authentic roots of jazz music. To Crouch, jazz was America's classical music, a sophisticated art form that had been developed primarily by African American musicians who had transformed pain, struggle, and cultural heritage into something transcendently beautiful. This philosophical position put Crouch on a collision course with Miles Davis, who by 1986 was deep into what critics called his commercial period. Miles had been experimenting with pop music, working with contemporary producers, and creating albums that sounded more like contemporary R&B than traditional jazz. The breaking point came when Miles released his album Tutu in 1986. Produced by Tommy LaPuma and featuring contemporary electronic sounds, hip-hop-influenced rhythms, and pop sensibilities, the album was a radical departure from anything Miles had done before. To many jazz fans, it sounded like Miles was chasing commercial success rather than pursuing artistic integrity. Stanley Crouch listened to Tutu and was horrified. This wasn't just artistic evolution. This was, in his view, artistic betrayal. Miles Davis, the man who had created Kind of Blue, who had pioneered cool jazz and hard bop and fusion, was now making what Crouch saw as shallow pop music, designed to sell records rather than advance the art form. But Crouch's attack went beyond simple musical criticism. In a scathing review published in The Village Voice, Crouch delivered what he intended to be the ultimate condemnation of Miles's career trajectory. Miles Davis, Crouch wrote, has become jazz history's most brilliant sellout. He possesses the musical intelligence and technical skill to create genuine art, but has chosen instead to prostitute his talents in service of commercial trends. He has abandoned the profound cultural mission of jazz music and instead embraced the shallow materialism of pop culture. The phrase "most brilliant sellout" was particularly devastating because it acknowledged Miles's undeniable talent while simultaneously destroying his artistic credibility. Crouch wasn't saying Miles lacked ability. He was saying that Miles was using his extraordinary abilities for unworthy purposes. The attack continued. Davis has turned his back on the African American musical tradition that created him, rejected the sophisticated harmonic language that made him famous, and reduced himself to a mere entertainer, playing simple grooves for audiences who wouldn't recognize real jazz if it was played in their living rooms. This wasn't just music criticism. This was character assassination. Crouch was attacking Miles's integrity, his cultural authenticity, and his commitment to his own artistic legacy. The jazz world was stunned by the ferocity of Crouch's attack. Music journalists began taking sides. Some agreed with Crouch's assessment, arguing that Miles had indeed compromised his artistic vision in pursuit of commercial success. Others defended Miles, arguing that artistic evolution was necessary for any vital art form. But everyone wanted to know one thing: how would Miles Davis respond? For weeks, Miles remained silent. Those close to him said he was deeply hurt by Crouch's attack, particularly the suggestion that he had betrayed African American musical culture. Miles had always been proud of his role in developing and advancing black music, and the accusation of cultural betrayal cut deep. Finally, at a press conference in November 1986, a reporter asked Miles directly about Crouch's criticism. Miles looked at the reporter with those penetrating eyes, paused for a moment, and delivered a response that would be quoted for decades. "Stanley Crouch," Miles said, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority, "is a failed musician who became a critic because he couldn't make it as an artist. He talks about authenticity and tradition, but he's never created anything original in his life. He's never taken a risk, never pushed boundaries, never contributed anything to the music except opinions." Miles paused, letting that sink in. "You want to know about sellouts? A sellout is someone who stops growing, who stops taking chances, who plays it safe because they're afraid of what the critics might say. I've been making music for 40 years, and I've never made the same album twice. Every record I make is an attempt to find something new, to push myself and the music forward." The response was devastating in its precision. Miles wasn't just defending himself, he was attacking the entire premise of Crouch's authority to make such judgments. "Crouch talks about African American musical tradition like he owns it," Miles continued. "But tradition isn't a museum piece. Tradition is something living, something that grows and changes and adapts. The musicians who created jazz, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Charlie Parker, they weren't traditionalists, they were revolutionaries. They took existing music and transformed it into something completely new." Miles was building toward his most devastating point. "And you know what the real difference is between me and Stanley Crouch? I make music. He just talks about it. I create something that didn't exist before. He just comments on what other people create. So when he calls me a sellout, what he's really saying is that he wishes he had something to sell out." The response sent shockwaves through the jazz world. Miles hadn't just defended his music, he had questioned the entire legitimacy of music criticism as an institution. But Miles wasn't finished. Crouch thinks he's defending jazz tradition, but what he's really defending is his own irrelevance. He's afraid that if music keeps evolving, keeps changing, keeps reaching new audiences, then his little world of academic jazz criticism becomes meaningless. So he attacks anyone who threatens that world. Miles looked directly at the reporter who had asked the question. "I don't make music for critics. I make music for people who love music, and if Stanley Crouch doesn't like it, that tells me I'm doing something right." The immediate reaction to Miles's response was explosive. Jazz musicians began choosing sides in what the press started calling the Davis-Crouch War. Some supported Crouch's position that jazz should maintain its sophisticated artistic standards. Others rallied behind Miles's argument that artistic evolution was essential for any living art form. But what made Miles's response particularly powerful was how it reframed the entire debate. Instead of defending his specific musical choices, Miles had attacked the fundamental premise that critics should have authority over artists' creative decisions. The argument resonated far beyond jazz. Musicians in every genre began referencing Miles's response when dealing with their own critical attacks. The idea that creating was more valuable than criticizing, that taking artistic risks was more important than maintaining traditional standards, became a rallying cry for artists facing conservative criticism. Stanley Crouch, for his part, was not prepared for the ferocity of Miles's counterattack. He had expected Miles to either ignore the criticism or offer a defensive explanation of his musical choices. Instead, Miles had questioned Crouch's entire professional legitimacy. Crouch attempted to respond in subsequent articles, arguing that criticism played an important role in maintaining artistic standards, and that Miles's attack on critics was anti-intellectual. But the damage was done. Miles had successfully shifted the narrative from his own alleged artistic failures to the broader question of who had the authority to judge artistic worth. More importantly, history began to vindicate Miles's position. The 2-2 album, which Crouch had dismissed as commercial pandering, was later recognized as an innovative work that successfully bridged jazz and contemporary music. Young musicians began studying the album, learning from its combination of traditional jazz improvisation and modern production techniques. The broader fusion movement that Crouch had criticized as a betrayal of jazz tradition proved to be enormously influential, inspiring new generations of musicians and keeping jazz relevant to contemporary audiences. Artists like Herbie Hancock, Weather Report, and Return to Forever, all of whom had faced similar criticism from traditionalists, were eventually recognized as having expanded rather than diminished the jazz tradition. Even more significantly, Miles's argument about the nature of artistic tradition proved prophetic. The jazz musicians of the 1990s and 2000s who achieved the greatest success were those who, like Miles, refused to be confined by traditional genre boundaries. Artists like Robert Glasper, Esperanza Spalding, and Kamasi Washington built their careers on exactly the kind of boundary-crossing experimentation that Crouch had criticized. The Davis-Crouch War became a case study in the relationship between artists and critics, frequently cited in music journalism programs and artist development workshops. Miles's response became required reading for musicians learning to deal with criticism and for critics learning to understand their proper role in the artistic ecosystem. But perhaps the most important legacy of Miles's response was how it empowered other artists to resist critical orthodoxy. Musicians began understanding that they didn't have to accept critics' definitions of what their music should be, that artistic integrity could include commercial success, and that evolution was more important than preservation. Years later, when Stanley Crouch was asked about his conflict with Miles Davis, he admitted that he had perhaps been too harsh in his criticism. He acknowledged that Miles's later work, while different from his earlier albums, had its own artistic merit and had influenced a new generation of musicians. "I still believe in the importance of maintaining jazz standards," Crouch said in a 2005 interview. "But I've come to understand that those standards can be expressed in different ways, and that artistic evolution is as important as artistic tradition." Miles, characteristically, never backed down from his position. In interviews throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, he continued to argue that critics who had never created original art had no business telling artists how to express themselves. "The only opinion that matters about my music," Miles said in a 1990 interview, "is the opinion of people who actually listen to it and connect with it. Critics are just middlemen trying to insert themselves between artists and audiences. Most of the time, they just get in the way." The most brilliant sellout controversy became one of the defining moments in Miles Davis's later career, not because of the criticism itself, but because of how Miles transformed a personal attack into a broader statement about artistic freedom and the role of critics in the creative process. Today, when artists face criticism for evolving their sound or reaching for broader audiences, Miles's response to Stanley Crouch is still quoted as a defense of artistic independence. His argument that creating is more valuable than criticizing, that taking risks is more important than playing it safe, and that tradition must evolve to remain vital, continues to influence musicians and artists across all disciplines. The lesson of the Davis-Crouch controversy is clear. Critics may have opinions, but artists have the final word. And when an artist of Miles Davis's stature decides to fight back, the results can change how an entire industry thinks about the relationship between criticism and creativity. If this incredible story of artistic defiance and critical warfare inspired you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to understand the power of standing up to criticism and defending your artistic vision. Have you ever been criticized for trying something new in your work? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to check out more stories about the battles that shaped music history.